Professor. Good afternoon. My name is Franek Večorka. I will be moderating the second panel of today's conference. I think Václav Havel would be probably disappointed in topic of our today's conversation. I mean, in developments of democracy and freedoms across Central and Eastern Europe. Václav Havel believed in reversibility of democratic change, and he had high expectations from young journalists born already after Soviet Union collapsed. He said, "They have grown up and studied in surroundings much closer to true democratic values than the earlier generations." Important to remind that Václav Havel was the person who invited Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty to Prague. This way, he demonstrated that the symbol of free word now is associated with our region. I mean, the region of Central and Eastern Europe. We in Belarus, I'm from Belarus, remember that how much Václav Havel did for freedom of speech in our country. Indeed, now a large part of post-communist countries have made a step or more back from the level of liberties reached immediately after anti-communist revolutions. The strongest move towards non-democratic patterns is shown by Russia, where the model of imitated democracy is replaced by typical imperial autocracy. Even Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus, without any progress from his side, has lost his deserved title of the last European dictator. However, the autocratic regimes exchange experience in controlling media and using them as propaganda tools. Is the democratic world in position to face this challenge and to defend freedom of media expression in this region, to protect information space from anti-democratic propaganda? This is a topic for our discussion, and contributors to our panel discussion are distinguished experts on the situation of the media in Central Eastern Europe, and all of them have deep personal experience of working and studying in the region. Let me introduce the panelists. This is Ms. Jill Dougherty, former foreign affairs correspondent for CNN. Mr. Alexander Dardelli, vice president of IREX. And J.K. Chaki, senior researcher for Nations of Transit in Freedom House. So we will start with a popular topic of propaganda. I know that Putin's propaganda machine effectively uses so-called Western crisis of values, which we discussed in the first panel as well, in order to manifest itself as the less traditional values defender. The media space is the most important channel for promotion to this image. The penetration of Kremlin propaganda is noted in Latvia, Slovakia, Serbia, Hungary, everywhere across Europe. So my first question will be to Jill. How does Russian anti-democratic propaganda use a freedom of expression in democratic countries?
Well, you know, I'd like to keep it very focused, I think, on when we use a very straight understanding of words. And propaganda, in this sense, I'm going to use in a very concrete fashion. I'm not going to say that it's, you know, good, bad, or indifferent, because every country uses propaganda. But what I would say is our image of how propaganda is used often is kind of this idea that men with guns go and take over studios and tell people what to say. And actually, in the modern world, in Russia right now, and certainly in the countries where Russian broadcasting and media are heard, sometimes in the Russian language, that's not the case. It's a softer approach, if you want to, that came up in the previous panel, kind of a softer way of approaching this. So what do I mean by soft? It would be, let's say, taking over media outlets economically under the guise of saying that the previous editor was not doing a good job or was misusing funds, and therefore this media outlet should be run correctly. And usually, of course, the person who comes in as the next editor is a person who supports the government and wants to keep it in power. I'd also say that you know, the media propaganda, I don't think should be looked at as one kind of separate element out by itself in the way we kind of sometimes traditionally look at that. It's part of, you know, economics, politics, military strategy, and then also, you know, the cyber, which is part of military and political and many other things, are all worked in together. They're all part of this kind of nexus of communication, message, and narrative. And, you know, if there's one thing that, as I look at media, I was the Moscow bureau chief for CNN for about 9 years, and I've watched, you know, as carefully as I could to try to understand what's going on. Russian TV right now, and in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, certainly the Baltics, where people do speak Russian, many of them, you can actually see direct broadcasts from Moscow. So what do you see? You do not see somebody sitting there, you know, with a piece of paper reading propaganda. What you see is very entertaining. It's very, very well done. I watched it when I was in Estonia last year for a couple of months. I used to watch it every morning and looked forward to having my cup of coffee and watching Russian morning TV because it goes down easy. It's fun. It's very well done. And Russian TV has a lot of shows that are really fun to watch. Worked into that, of course, is the news broadcast where you do get the propaganda, but sometimes that even is very entertainingly done. Example, when Russia first went into Syria, much of the reporting was, they had obviously, and I'm speaking as a TV person, they had obviously sent very sophisticated cameras, crews, editors, shooters, and so the reports, the early reports of the incursion of planes, Russian planes in Syria, was exciting Star Wars video. It was really, really well done. You saw the planes taking off. They had elevated cameras, so it looked like a movie. And it made you feel, you know, just great that the Russian Air Force was going in there and setting things right. So I guess what I'm saying is we have to kind of, maybe we, have to change our understanding of how propaganda is done. It can be entertaining. It can also be confusing. And I think we've talked about this. I'm sure we'll talk more. But it raises all sorts of issues that don't appear to be propaganda-based initially. I would say one of the points that Brian Whitmore made this morning, which I think is key, is that the failures of Western democracy are exploited against Western democracy. You see this very much in RT, Russian television, you know, RT, formerly Russia Today, which broadcasts in a variety of languages, in which they depict citizens of the United States or the West as hapless victims of their governments, which are out not to protect them, but to put them in harm's way. And then also, I don't want to blab on here too long, but there's one other point, which I think is really crucial to understand. And that is what is very, very effective, I think especially in Central and Eastern Europe, is to exploit the disenchantment that people have in that region for why democracy did not work. Go back to, 2008, economic problems, the changing economic situation, people without jobs. I think that is one of the most important things, because if we go back, and this year it's 25 years at the end of the Soviet Union, and then even before that, the fall of the wall, where people really did expect in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and in Russia, that life would get better, and very quickly, because democracy would come, it would be the end of the old structure, and we would live well. And when people don't live well, they base it very much on their daily life. not on theories, not on democracy, not on these big concepts. They base it on everyday life. And if they are not living well, they are fertile ground for another message, which says that liberal democracy doesn't work, that you need, we refer to it as illiberal democracy, but let's say a more centralized vertical control of society. And that is a major problem, because I know we're going to get into how do you answer this. One of the best ways I think the West can answer it is by improving life in the West and making sure that people's rights are protected. That is a real challenge.
If I may add something, actually, it's interesting you elaborated on the concept of propaganda. And I think we use interchangeably three words: propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation. And at the risk of sounding a bit academic, I think it's worth dissecting a bit these words. Because propaganda typically means purposeful dissemination of information, alignment with a certain bias. Now, that bias is clearly there in propaganda. Hypothetically, in theory, it could be correct, the bias. What we observe in the case of the Russian machine, the Russian propaganda machine, more aptly should be called disinformation, actually, because it's a purposeful, orchestrated dissemination of misleading, deceitful, or wrong information. What are some of its elements? First, there's always a multiplicity of sources. There's a multiplicity of views. While multiple, they are not necessarily correct. There's use of infotainment for conveying strategic messages. There's weaponization of information. And behind this, there's grand design. So I think in this case, perhaps the more correct term, and I think we should embrace this term, is disinformation. Then we use misinformation a bit loosely, but basically that's unintentional the spreading of wrong information. So we clearly are facing a case of disinformation in this case. And clearly there is grand design and good orchestration behind this campaign of disinformation. And I think it's important to highlight these differences, because sometimes I fear that by overemphasizing propaganda, our response becomes a bit mechanical, and we tend to basically fund and focus attention, good attention, on mechanisms that counter directly what should be correctly called propaganda as opposed to disinformation.
Yeah, actually, we had a discussion before this panel, and we have a disagreement about propaganda, because as I see, Russian propaganda is a very unique phenomenon, which includes, of course, misinformation, disinformation, but also very active work in new media, including Russian trolls. And you know, it's not about disinformation, because as I see, as a consumer in Belarus media, infiltrated with Russian propaganda, they do not disinform you. They give you so much opinions. 99% of them are maybe wrong, but you just stop to think. You understand that it's a lot of garbage. It's not my idea. It's not my task to understand what is true, what is not. And the same happens in Twitter, Facebook. You know, they give a lot of messages, and even part of these messages are true, but you get like 200 notifications on your Twitter application on iPhone, and you say, oh my God, I will unsubscribe from this Twitter account. But my question is to Jakey, because you work in Freedom House and you can analyze the whole region. Why this Russian influence, misinformation, propaganda, why it's successful in one countries and not successful in another?
Thank you, Franak, and thank you for the Atlantic Council for the invitation for this very important discussion. And I'm very glad that we started unpacking what propaganda means and how it works in different countries. And I want to continue in this direction. And what you were saying, Jill, in the end, I want to continue in this direction and make a general observation, taking a step back, that in the risk of sounding somewhat contrarian, but I think often when we discuss propaganda, we tend to overlook the actorness of the countries involved, of the countries on the receiving end of propaganda. And I do think that that can be a problem, because then we might not be able to come up with the right answers. And in Central Europe, so for example, when a Central European, let's say traditionalist politician makes a statement about the demise of the West, we can be quite sure the next day to read articles in the media about how Russia is using this and how it benefits Russia. And now I'm not saying that these articles are not correct, because obviously they are. But I think that when we overlook the actorness of these countries, what Jill was saying, we forget that there are pragmatic and political reasons behind the way these politicians act. And we also tend to forget or not pay enough attention, as you were saying, that there is an opportunity for Russia to insert itself into the discussion, but that opportunity is there because there are problems. And unfortunately, in this case, Russia acts as an amplifier of these voices, whether those voices are Eurosceptic, far-right, intolerant, whichever, and that is the bigger problem. But to answer your question, of course, so the reasons, the first reason for the differences between how countries react and whether they are a good, fertile ground for propaganda are historical and political. So countries with a cultural proximity to Russia and to Slavic culture are obviously more susceptible to this kind of propaganda. So for example, in Southern Europe, let's say in the Balkans, Serbia or Bulgaria, the situation is very different there than in Central Europe. The other factor is the presence of pro-Russian actors, politicians. And in the case of Central Europe, these are often far-right parties, politicians. So for example, Jobbik in Hungary, although now Jobbik is moderating, so I don't know what to say about that. Or paramilitary organizations in Slovakia, fringe actors. Certainly the presence of these actors help the spread of propaganda. But I do want to make it clear that focusing on the Visegrad countries in the media, Russian propaganda is right now not as significant as in other countries. There is no RT, no local language channels, and there are a few websites that peddle conspiracy theories. So it works in the way of disinformation, that peddle conspiracy theories, share sensationalistic news items. And right now, that's actually the biggest problem, more in Czech Republic and Slovakia, but to some extent in Hungary and to a very little extent in Poland.
I have a question to Alexander about consumers. Yes, yeah. How to make consumers of media information to divide, propaganda from truthful information.
I'm glad you're asking these questions. Actually, as it happens, my organization IREX is working specifically in this area. But let me take a step back. And then for about 25 years, almost 3 decades, we've focused almost exclusively on the supply side of information, working with media organizations, working with print organizations, TV, associations of journalists, basically the people that produce, generate content, generate information, generate news. And the focus has been, in many cases, right. This focus was necessary, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was much attention paid to the legal enabling environment, actually, in terms of introducing in constitutions protections for free speech, decriminalizing defamation, and other legal elements. But not much has been done from the angle of the consumers. Ultimately, I think all propaganda or misinformation or disinformation seeks to do is actually change the mind of a consumer of information. So we need to focus on the consumer. Much can be done actually to dilute disinformation, to dilute propaganda by developing critical information consumption skills. And what do we mean by that, basically? Information is a good. It is a public good, but it is not too dissimilar than other goods, including food that we consume, actually. And so by developing critical information consumption skills, we in many ways develop demand for better information, demand for independent media, demand for independent information, as well as strengthen the ethics of the profession and, in effect, neutralize the ultimate effect of propaganda or disinformation. We have just piloted the program in Ukraine, and you know Ukraine is pretty much a battleground for disinformation and propaganda because of the issue of Crimea and the conflict on the east. And we have some very interesting finds, actually. And Ukraine is somewhat atypical. It doesn't represent Central Europe or the Balkans, actually. But there are some similarities with Russia, Belarus, as well as the Caucasus. And so in Ukraine, the data is that the trust in media is very low, 35%. This is not atypical, actually. This exists here. It exists in Eastern Europe. The media consumption is very high. 73% of the people watch news every day, typically on TV. Yet only 23% of people cross-check or verify the news that they read. This is an abysmally low number, actually. So we implemented a program which we designed with funding from Canada, and we trained a group of trainers that in turn reached 15,000 people. And basically the training program focused on verifying sources, avoiding emotional content, going to multiple sources of information, looking for fact-checking websites or pieces of data, going to citizen reporters for additional information, going to investigative reporting networks for information, and developing the skills to analyze information. And only because of this intervention, we have data from Ukraine that says there was a 22% increase in those who check or cross-check the news they see or hear, 26% increase in participants' confidence in analyzing news, and 24% increase in participants' ability to distinguish trustworthy news from false news. We're talking a 6-month intervention with some dramatic, actually, data. And the data covers 14 provinces/regions of Ukraine. So it is not Kiev-based, it is not Eastern-based only, it's pretty much cross-country. So we can do much with consumers. This is an area for additional investment. And I think the promise of investment here is tremendous. We don't have all the answers, we don't have all the data, but this is one area in which we need to invest. In addition to this, there is this linkage between producers of information, generators of information, including content, and civil society. This linkage hasn't been leveraged appropriately. Sometimes we conceive of media as media. This is basically the fourth estate. They produce information, content, they disseminate that content. But in effect, actually, there is an intermediary between the consumers of information and media. And typically, this is civil society. And so civil society is an enhancer of good information, a quality control on information, as well as a fact checker on information. I think more needs to be done on this linkage, and more cooperation and possibilities for using civil society should be explored in terms of producing citizen reporters, supporting investigative reporting efforts, as well as fact-checking and cross-reporting.
But you gave an example of Ukraine, where the most of TV channels are owned by oligarchs. So the question to you, what is the impact of ownership of media, not only in Ukraine, but all over Central Eastern Europe, to the quality of this information and to influence of misinformation as well?
Well, this is a great question, and it's also a very difficult question. So this region actually is a very diverse region. So let me start by saying that. So the problems you see in Central Europe are not necessarily the problems you see in Russia or Ukraine or the Caucasus or the Balkans. We're talking different cultures, different historical backgrounds, different levels of economic growth, different linguistic capabilities, and the ability to be exposed to foreign languages or foreign media. So having said this, there are some common trends. And if you take a step back and look at the fall of the Berlin Wall and what happened, actually, we had a number of mega trends in the 90s. And the first mega trend was basically the collapse of the state-owned media and the privatization of media, of the media outlets. The second mega trend was basically the introduction of legal protections, typically in constitutions for free speech and the operationing of free media. And the third mega trend was the transformation of the typically state-controlled TV into public broadcasting systems or reform state-controlled TVs. And then we move into the 2000s. And then we see some interesting megatrends vis-a-vis ownership. Associated with a trend of increased foreign direct investment in general, in any industry, we see increased foreign direct investment in the media, typically in Central Europe, but then it stretches out to Eastern Europe, to the Balkans and further out east. And then there is at least the perception that foreign ownership creates a bit of a buffer between the old institutions of control, propaganda, disinformation, and the ability to generate good content. But then we have the meltdown of 2008, and we have a collapse in the markets actually worldwide. And Central Europe and Eastern Europe is one of the regions of the world that suffered the most because of this collapse, that they had dramatic drops in GDP production. And it affects the media market, clearly. It affects the advertising market, which is basically the lifeblood of media. So you have a shrinking advertising market, basically, that introduces a number of trends. Because of this shrinking advertising market and the decrease of the purchasing power, you have the foreign investors exiting Eastern Europe. We have the Swedish Bonnier Group exiting its market. We have WAZ exiting its market. We have News Corporation exiting its markets. This clearly relates to the 2008 crisis and the aftermath of that crisis. And what happens in the meantime? Well, you have a number of so-called oligarchs or minigarchs or business conglomeration that basically add media to a multiplicity of interests. And this is very interesting because these are not the traditional media owners. They own many things, from coal to agriculture to media. And typically, we see a trend that media is used as a platform for either pushing a political agenda, and clearly sometimes the lines between these owners and politicians are very thin, if non-existent at all, or pushing their own business agendas. So that's a very disturbing trend. And then the shrink in advertising and the fact that now you have business owners with multiple interests controlling media basically destroys the so-called Chinese wall between editorial independence and where the money comes. So if you're a journalist working for an entity that is controlled by one of these business entities or oligarchs, then you think twice more, actually, for fear of losing your job or your revenue when you write something that is against the interests of the owner or against the interests of that business. So I think this is one of the most disturbing trends that we've seen in Eastern Europe, generally speaking. And then, in effect, what you have right now, you have dysfunctional media markets. We have a media failure of sorts in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. So markets have not been able to allocate resources efficiently for the production of good, reliable, quality information. It is a media market failure, actually. And what do you do with media market failures, actually? You typically intervene. We've done it here in our economy. You've done it elsewhere. And I think markets still have the best potential to allocate resources efficiently and effectively for the production of good information, but they need an intervention, in this case, from outside. In effect, in Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia, but so is the case in many other countries in Eastern Europe, the buffer that used to be the ownership between the government and the producers of the content, the journalists, is either non-existent or very much eroding. And so the journalists don't have protection in this sense. And what we need is we need to think carefully and hard about how to create new ownership structures in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe. And this is not applicable to the entire region. This is very difficult to do in Russia, actually, but it is possible in some other markets in Eastern Europe. And we have to do it in a number of ways. First, we have to acknowledge that the local sources of information, I think, have the highest potential for neutralizing disinformation, actually, because they come with credibility and they come with actually that on-the-ground feel, actually, that cannot be generated elsewhere. That's one. Two, we have to look at media literacy or critical information consumption skills. And three, the new structures, the new ownership structures. Now, there was investment. There was foreign direct investment in ownership in Eastern Europe. And there was a perception that now the journalists were protected because the foreign owners could actually fend off whatever pressure was coming from the politicians or the changing governments. That was not always necessarily the case, but the perception was there. So, right?
Can I ask Jill? Yes, it's very
sure.
Good introduction to the next part of the discussion. Jill, is any difference, for example, if the TV station is owned by Russian oligarch or Japanese private company? How will it influence information, the quality of information, objectivity of the content it produces?
Well, I mean, speaking in generalizations is very hard because I don't know who the Japanese would be, I don't know who the Russian would be. And actually there are some outlets in Russia or right outside of Russia that do a good job.
Yep.
But in general, I'd say the more you have, as Alexander was just saying, control of people who have an agenda. It might be their own economic agenda, it might be their own political agenda, it might be the agenda of the ruling party or person. the more direct influence on the journalists you're going to have. And then also in societies where there's not that much money floating around for journalists who are working, it's very difficult for them to kind of fight that because they can starve in trying to do the right thing, you know, in writing whatever the truth is. So it's, I think it would, that's a very big generalization, but there's no question in my mind that there can often be direct influence. But you know, I also think there is this kind of malevolent directed journalism, and then there is what I would call like the agnostic journalism. You know, many of the people, and I know Russia best, so maybe I have to talk about that most, and it's a very diverse market in Central Europe, but you know, many of the people who got into broadcasting and ownership in the early days of Russia and now continue to control it come from, you know, the advertising world. They come from an area where they really don't have, let's call it, ideas of their own. What they are, they're in a sense hired guns. They know that advertising in Russia can make you a lot of money. Owning a television station can make you a lot of money. And being close to the governing people, close to the Kremlin, can also make your life pretty easy. So you tend to toe that line. But do they, can they change? Yes. That is why you sometimes get these zigs and zags in public policy by the Kremlin. The Kremlin does a lot of polling, constant polling, in fact, of what Russians are thinking and how the message du jour is getting out. And witness recently what happened with Turkey, you know? Turkey, Russia, great friends. Then Turkey shoots down a Russian plane on the border with Syria. All of a sudden, they are terrible enemies. And the media switched overnight. So then Erdogan was an enemy. Now they're back to being friends again. And there's another, you know, mind swiveling, head swiveling turn. So the media can be used not because there is some underlying ideological idea. It's what serves the person who is in charge or the person whom they want to serve.
Jackie, we have a very spectacular hot example from Hungary about the closure of the popular newspaper there. So my question to you is, what's wrong with Hungary? You know, the member of European Union, and how actually to stop interference of politicians to media sphere?
So when I was preparing for this panel discussion, I of course looked at our data at Freedom House and looked at the countries in comparison, and I saw that, of course, the Visegrad countries, except for Hungary, they are all rated free in our press freedom report. Hungary is partly free right now, and in Nations in Transit, the report I am working on, they are all Central European countries are doing relatively well compared to, let's say, Russia. They are all in the upper third of this list, and somewhat better than the Balkans, and of course much better than Russia. So first I thought that you know, instead of zeroing in on illiberal leaders, maybe we should shift the discussion, shift the focus a little bit, and also talk about the enabling environment as we have done so far. And then, of course, the news of Népszabadság shuttering came. But I do want to follow up on what Alex was saying, because I think it's important to be aware of the larger trends. And I just want to add one thing to that, as we were saying, foreign capital left the region and this oligarchization happened. But there is also another trend that has been visible. So political interference in the region has always been part and parcel of the media market. This is nothing new. And an important reason behind that is that political parties, it is rooted in the transitions because political parties are poorly embedded in society. They have few members, they are not so active. So these parties, in a sense, they were somewhat forced to capture the state instead and abuse state resources or capture the media. And that's what some experts call the colonization of the media by parties. So they try to shape the legal context, the institutional framework in a way to benefit their party and to benefit their own cadre. And of course, Hungary is no exception to this. The case with Hungary is that it is probably at the further end of a very worrisome trend right now, a trend that some other countries, because of these underlying vulnerabilities, can also start on, as we have seen in the worrisome signs in Poland. Because in the case of Hungary, we have a strong leader who can exploit these vulnerabilities. And I think one important thing about Hungary is that a few years ago, we were very much focused on the legal framework. And I remember around 5 years ago when the media laws were passed, we had lengthy discussions about the media authority and its powers, how it will use it, the changes to the laws. And I think we sort of forgot to pay attention to the changes that have been happening underground, the so-called the harnessing of the market by political forces. So essentially, political forces have reshaped the market. The government there has been a stealth, slow takeover by oligarchs, businessmen, other people, interests close to the government in some connection with the government. And I think we fail to see these changes gradually happening. And I think that Népszabadság was just one other step in that trend. And of course, Népszabadság's case might be somewhat new because this already happened in 2014 when another online portal, Origo, wrote about the lavish expenses of Minister X. And after that, the editor-in-chief was shortly fired, and the newsroom resigned, and eventually it was sold to interests which we can say are somewhat aligned with the government. And Népszabadság's case is another step in this direction, unfortunately. And I don't see quick fixes because of these underlying vulnerabilities, because of what we have been talking about. Because as long as there is not enough money, there is not enough funding, these trends will be very hard to tackle.
Yes, please, of course.
This is actually a great thought. There's not enough funding, there's not enough money. And so we've been talking about the problems so far and the trends, but what could be the solution? I actually think that you're looking at and I've advocated for this idea for a while, so bear with me. One is we have to take a regional approach, actually, except for Russia and Ukraine and the Russian-speaking actually periphery. Some of these markets are very fragmented, are very small. So you have to create sort of regional markets where investment is made on a regional basis so that there is possibility for higher margins, one. Two, there are some great efforts going on right now as we speak, actually, to develop investigative reporting networks in this space. You have the BERN, Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, quite successful, and the OCCRP project, actually, that focuses more specifically on Eastern Europe. We need to expand these networks. We need to create additional networks. And more importantly, we need, using this regional approach, need to create markets for their products, because unless their products are sold, these entities will not be sustainable. And third, and I think very important, we have to take a long-haul approach to changing the face of ownership in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe. This is not a 2-decade effort. This is not a 3-decade effort. This is a longer effort. There are some other areas of life where we've done this successfully. West's interventions and investments in the banking sector have radically improved the banking sector, and it is kind of sustainable and well-functioning in this space. We need a similar approach, perhaps through the creation of a media development fund that takes a long-haul approach to creating regional markets and new ownership structures, and then infuses them with structures and mechanisms for enforcing editorial control and independence. And last but not least, I think we have a lot of potential in the new and social media, actually, as an entity for being, as a mechanism rather, for being disruptive in the old ownership landscape and creating new institutions of ownership and new spaces for quality information.
Jill, what do you think about potential of new media, social media, actually for countries like Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, in time of important events like Maidan protests, new media, there was only one platform, one independent free space where people can coordinate and spread their ideas. Could new media be the solution, to this problem mentioned during our discussion?
Well, I think they're going to be part of it, whether they're good or bad or indifferent. They're here. So what do you do with them? I agree that in the beginning, going back a few years, they had a very good influence on bringing people together, informing people of demonstrations, and civically getting people involved in civic organizations, etc. But right now, the new media are, it's a kind of a crazy world out there in terms of information. I mean, I think that this is probably the most disruptive, in the bad sense of the term, part of the media right now. It is virtually uncontrollable. Even in democracies, well-developed democracies like the United States and the election right now, you see the use of new media, disinformation, confusion. Alexander early on pointed out this kind of wall of information that is spewed by all sorts of networks. I keep going back to something that came at the first panel, and it's coming up here again, that in some of the basic building blocks of democracy, Western-style democracy, we do not have education for our citizens in how they work. So it's so obvious. People, it was pointed out, Slovakia doesn't have, if this is correct, education in history after World War II. Well, of course, then they don't understand communism. They don't understand the fall of communism. And the same thing is happening in Russia. Many of the most ardent supporters of Putin are very young people who never went through the Soviet Union, who do not remember the things that Stalin did. And in fact, he's a hero at this point. In the West, in the United States, we have no real education for young people in what is capitalism. How does it work? How does money work? How do markets work? What is the system that we live in? So I think that ultimately this is going to be a wake-up call for a lot of countries in the West, in let's say old Europe, new Europe, if we can use that term, and other places, that if we want this society, liberal democracy to function, we have to know what it is. And we have to tell our young people and ourselves, what are the principles? Because there are studies out there, and I'm sure you both know about this, studies that show that in many countries, people prefer to stick with a lie because it is easier to believe it. Sometimes there's comfortability with lies. And this is statistically shown, where people can be given information that is correct and they will reject it because it feels better, it is easier, whatever, to believe the comfortable lies.
Thank you, Jill. In Belarus, every first year school, children, they are taken to Stalin line. It's the biggest museum, a prize in Stalin, and where you can drink vodka for Stalin, Lenin, and of course, in their heads, the reality with history is mixed. Minsk and Belarus is called as a communism with a taste of cappuccino because on the main avenue in the city you can see McDonald's and Burger King, and in front of it Dzerzhinsky, Lenin Monument, and KGB building. And of course, in this mixed reality, people do not have any concrete values, and for them it's very difficult to understand who they are, to which civilization they belong. But now it's time for your questions. Please raise your hand and name yourself and your affiliation. Please, you were first, this gentleman. Please wait a second for microphone.
Thank you. András Lőke, Transparency International, Hungary. It seems that the games in freedom of speech or freedom of press has changed tremendously, because the old game was censorship. Now no one is talking about censorship. Everyone is talking about volume, about reach. So the louder you say something, the more you say something, the more interesting way you say something, and the audience think is truer. So there is a new game, and reach or entertainment can be created by money. So in the end, I think this is basically a competition within political forces which are fought by the way of money. So under these circumstances, what do you think is the short-term possibility to counter Russian propaganda? Because the long-term possibility might be better education, but that might take a generation. What is the short-term possibility for that?
Thank you for the question. I like questions about Russian propaganda, but Alex, yeah.
Well, I think it's a great question, actually. I totally agree that, the game has changed. It's no longer about censorship. It's about reach, volume, mass production of multiple sources, of information, while at the same time driving an agenda, a well-orchestrated design behind that agenda. So what do you do about it? Actually, I think actually education deserves a bit more attention and funding, because ultimately actually the investments now in education pay off. Actually, and there's literature out there that actually supports this theory. It's not simply theory, there's some data behind this. But short term, I see this area of critical information consumption skills, sometimes called media literacy, sometimes called critical thinking skills actually, as one that has tremendous potential and one in which we need to invest actually. So you're not dealing with necessarily children or youth, although you can deal with adults and build up their critical information consumption skills. It goes a bit back to Jill's point about sometimes feeding information that is wrong to people and they nonetheless believe it or have a comfort zone with it that somehow makes it palatable. So these approaches address some of these issues and address some of these absences of skills and build skills to counter disinformation and propaganda. That's one. I think actually short-term solutions, there is no one magic bullet. There is not one solution. Have to also consider things such as investments and more attention to rather credible and well-skilled citizen reporters, actually, that produce alternative points of view that are ground truths, that basically relate directly to the reality of life for people who live through these stories. And then additional investments in investigative reporting, and this is the creation of regional markets for their products, actually. We have seen some fantastic stories come out of Eastern Europe and Central Europe from existing investigative reporting networks. We need more of them. They are the real stories, and people actually have hunger for them and consume them. And they have the potential to basically build up the democracy residual of values that we badly need at this time in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. I think these are some preliminary thoughts.
Jake, Jill, do you want to answer?
I think those are all really interesting ideas. I think they're very smart. I tend to look at kind of trends a lot. And just standing back, one of the real challenges is that if you go back to the Soviet days, there was an ideology, communism, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. And there was a concrete idea which Russia, the Soviet Union, was trying to propagandize. There was a message. And it's quite obvious right now that Russia really doesn't have a message, and that's what makes it kind of complicated. Yeah. The message is really, it's not a cohesive ideology. It's not Marxism-Leninism. And it's not really a cohesive, we are better or we have better ideas that will function. It's really knocking down and undermining the liberal democracy in the West. So it does change, I think, the equation in how you really answer this, because it's very referenced to the failings of Western society rather than the advantages of the East, of communism. So I don't think we fully quite grasp how to deal with that, because it brings us back to ourselves a lot. And unfortunately, that's where you get into all sorts of confusion about how you improve things.
Yeah, just a quick point that I very much agree with what you have said so far, and I think we have to stress that as citizen reporting and citizen reporters, and reporting on local stories, reporting on stories that that are relevant to people's lives should be something that we have to invest in. We have forgotten that and have focused on bigger projects. But people will only read and watch these stories if they are interesting to them. And that human element has been missing to some extent, I think.
Thank you. We are in Radio Free Europe. We believe that the best short-term response to Russian propaganda is high-quality journalism. We launched recently 24/7 TV channel in Russian language, and we improved our presence in social networks, new media of Radio Free Europe in different languages and local languages, which is very important to be closer to the societies. Very important not just to speak them in Russian because they understand Russian, but to let them understand that we speak their language, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and it works very well because Russian trolls and propagandists, they're useless in making discussions and in trolling in Ukrainian or Belarusians because they do not speak Ukrainian or Belarusians. And I'd like to add that propaganda, Russian propaganda, is very postmodernistic in the sense that they do not have concrete message, but their task is to destroy, traditional order, to devaluate traditional democratic institutions, to say that, oh, this European Parliament, they do not decide anything. Look at American elections, it's just like entertaining show. They're just giving these messages to show that everywhere is a mess. So don't worry about the mess in Russia. It's okay, but everywhere is the mess. Okay, so next question, please. Yeah. Oh, maybe there was a hand from the beginning there, this gentleman in a red tie. No, yes.
Thank you. Steven Stoltenberg. I work at the State Department. I'm an analyst there who follows mostly Poland and the Baltic states. I just got back from Warsaw, and in conversations I had there, I came upon some very disturbing information about the ways in which media freedoms are being undermined in Poland, at least allegations to that effect. And I thought I would mention a couple of examples to put this on people's radar, and then ask the panelists if how they would define or where are the red lines in terms of evidence that a government is actually undermining media freedoms in its own country. So what I heard in Warsaw was, for example, well, we all know, I think, or most of us know that the government in Poland passed a new public media law. But I'm curious how the panelists would define a situation where the government is actually exerting so much control over public media that we would consider that a threat to media freedom. And then with regards to private media, I heard that the government, again an allegation, the government has directed state-owned enterprises to withdraw their advertising from certain private media outlets. And this has resulted in considerable loss of advertising revenue, and now some of those outlets are considering layoffs, closing down regional offices. So this is just another example. So I think we need to be very attentive to the various ways, various instruments that governments may have at their disposal to undermine media freedoms. But I'm curious whether these examples from Poland ring a bell, whether they sound familiar to you from other examples. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to respond?
Sure. I think it's a very interesting question. It's a disturbing question. We at IREX implement this product called Media Sustainability Index, and it covers pretty much all of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, including Russia. Unfortunately, we're not doing it for Poland because the assumption of a number of years ago was that actually Poland and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that made it into the EU have turned the page, they are on a democratic path, and there is stability, and the democratic gains are irreversible. That does not seem to be necessarily the case. Actually, many people are expressing doubts about the foothold of these democratic gains in this part of the world. The Media Sustainability Index uses an interesting prism to actually measure media, the health of the media sector. So we look at first the legally enabling environment, and that's one category. Second, the quality of the profession, the journalists themselves. Third, the associated supporting institutions. Fourth, the multiplicity of views, the plurality of views that produce news in a country. And fifth, media as a business, actually. And there's a few red flags, and these objectives are divided in sub-objectives. It's a complex tool, actually. I encourage you take a look at it. It's online on our website. But some of the red flags that basically really are disturbing to media professionals as well as those who care for media and free information and quality information are excessive use of licensing by governments to dictate an agenda. That's one. if you know that you go through 10 hoops to get a simple license, actually, of whatever nature that is, actually, that shows some intent to restrict or make it difficult for independent media to operate professionally. One. Two, the use of state aid for political purposes, whether that's subsidies in the form of advertising or other state aids, including exemptions from VAT, value-added tax in Europe, for political purposes. And then the more finer and I think a bit more sophisticated tools that we use are, we use a thing called the media content analysis tool, whereby we actually take a look at content produced over a period of time for things such as multiplicity of views, verification of facts, whether there is more than one point of view, and whether it comes across as credible, and whether it meets standards of independent and journalistic professionalism. And so if you put content through this tool, typically you come away with some good indication of whether the government is imposing a line on its public media or not. And you can use it specifically for the public media. So these are some of the few red lines that you're looking for.
Yeah, just about public media. I mean, unfortunately, we have to say that public media in Central Europe has always been politicized and has always had a pro-government bent in most of these countries. But of course, there have been significant differences. And what we have seen in Poland is that the current government is more hostile, and the measures that they have taken so far are very worrisome for us. And of course, the parallels are there with Hungary, where it also started with legal changes. And in Poland as well, they are focusing on ownership to some extent. There's a lot of hostility towards German owners, a lot of talk for now. And I think you asked about red lines. I think there will be two sort of test cases to see where this will lead. One is that there was a media law, a draft law in Parliament in the spring. As far as I know, that's stalled right now. But that contained provisions which are highly problematic about how patriotic the media has to be and so on. So we have to see what happens to that law. And then the other thing is more of a test for the European Union in a sense that right now they have this rule of law procedure against Poland, not in the case of the media, but in the judiciary. And I think the deadline for that is coming up at the end of October. And this is a completely new process. So I think we will have to see what happens in that case, how the government reacts, whether the government is willing to step back. So yeah, I think we will know more soon.
Thank you. Please, more questions? Yes, please. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'll ask a question. Tim Nelson, State Department. Curious question on media funding for propaganda purposes in Russia. The importance of it is that most of it is being funded by Western businesses through advertising. It's the larger market. Is there any role that you can see in defunding the major Russian propaganda sources?
Can you give example?
I would say probably 60 to 80% of funding is Western businesses coming into Russia to fund any of the major propaganda channels.
This is actually, as I said initially, it's a difficult question. It's a good question, actually. I'm not quite sure, actually, of the data that you reference, whether that's indeed the case. And I think, actually, there is substantial local indigenous advertising markets in Russia, to the extent that I know. But assuming that that is indeed correct, actually, it's very challenging, actually, because as Jill said, actually, Russia sometimes uses the tools that we routinely employ here for business development purposes, for growth, the essential tools of capitalism, to distort the very nature of media. And so it's a challenge. I think long term, the solution has to come from taking a fresh look at the advertising markets, like the traditional advertising markets, and their role in propping up media organizations. This is very much an ongoing discourse in the United States, actually. This is a shifting landscape here, actually. The print media that used to be pretty much rely on advertising, actually, is under threat, is under duress. Advertising has gone elsewhere to websites, social media, TV. In the TV, it has remained strong, actually. So the question is, how do you reorient the advertising market now in Russia to not nefarious purposes, to good purposes, and how do you discourage funding in advertising market by foreign investors that may be perhaps unwittingly used by Kremlin for its own propaganda designs? I think the social media, new media, in my view, has a lot of potential here. And some of the ideas that have been circulated, and I think have a lot of promise and merit some deep thought, are sort of social impact investment models. You have out there in the world a lot of independent, quite wealthy, large asset holders, including the pension funds or including the sovereign wealth management funds, who have a specific, stated interest in the absence of volatility. They associate volatility with the absence of good governance, and good governance has a direct link with the quality of information. So the quality of information is one of the lifebloods of democracy. If you invest in good information, you're investing in democracy, you're investing in non-volatility, the absence of volatility. Maybe there is a way to capture some of their investment strategies and orient them towards non-advertisement-based models of supporting media and good messages, not only in Russia, but elsewhere. And frankly, the mass of this wealth, the mass of this asset, it's such that they will have sway if they choose to do this.
Jill, maybe you want to?
You know, I'm not quite sure, again, of those figures. I don't really have a concrete idea about this. I know the government does subsidize, there's no question, pours a lot of money into the media. With the cutbacks and sanctions, they have less money to put into it. But I think advertising is one of the key issues. I'll leave it. I think Alexander explained it well. I'm not an expert on that area.
I will add my few words. You know, when we are trying campaign, you know, to stop these Russian trolls and the Russian presence, we had a very, very big troubles with administrations of social networks managed from Russia, because Twitter, Facebook, of course, Contact, Instagram, they have their offices, usually controlled, usually based in Moscow. And any tries, for example, to unblock activists from Ukraine, they were unsuccessful, because Moscow offices, even of Facebook or Google, very often they supported pro-Russian activists and pro-Russian, let's say, propaganda there. Okay, please more. The question there, this gentleman, yeah, also with the red tie.
Hello, my name is Learson. I'm independently affiliated. I have a question about well, media from a U.S. policy perspective. I'd like to bring up an example. There's a web portal I followed for a long time. It was called sctimes.org, Southeast European Times, and it was mostly journalists in the Balkans working for this portal, which was, by the way, funded by the Department of Defense here. And it was I thought it was very good, very honest reporting on situations of transitional justice, corruption, and other political issues in the Balkans. And it had a very wide following. I think on Facebook it had 500,000 followers. I'd estimate, I wouldn't be surprised if it had up to 1 million people reading it, maybe not in a day, but over a month. And I think a few years ago, all of a sudden the site was shut down because the DoD pulled the funding. And almost simultaneously, you have the Russians coming in with their propaganda narratives through RT, Sputnik, and other sources. And they're pushing their own propaganda, while in the meantime, we are sort of disengaging in the region from a media perspective. So my question is, how do we get US policymakers, or how do we convince them to sort of re-engage with the region to sort of combat this this propaganda narratives that are being put out, which are, you know, as you guys are alluding to, it's mostly disinformation, and it's destabilizing in a sense. And I know most of your focus is on the local efforts, but I'm asking from a U.S. policy perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Who is ready?
You know, just jump in briefly because that's been a big debate for quite a long time. And I think one of the problems is the technology and the way the media work right now makes it extremely difficult to figure this out. I've been at so many different conferences where that question is asked. What does the West do? What does the United States do to answer? And usually it falls into old think of, you know, should we give more money to VOA? Should we give more money to RFERL? Should we answer them? Should we, usually they don't say lie, but it's usually put out as they can lie, we can't, therefore we're at a disadvantage. And I don't think right now there's really creative, I'm intrigued by some of the things that both the other guests are talking about in terms of, you know, looking at the media landscape the way it is, not the way it was, you know, 25 years ago, or even 30 years ago, and trying to figure out different ways of getting citizens educated to consume. I do keep going back to that. People are not, they're not cut off anymore. If you're in Moscow or you're in any of these countries, you're probably able to get almost all the information you want. It's a question of there's too much information.
Yeah.
So, and you're buried in it. And then there's disinformation, as we've been saying. And then there are wacky conspiracy theories. And I know I did a study in the Baltics in Estonia with a co-researcher, and we looked at precisely that, the influence of Russian media on Russian-speaking Estonians. And so many of them, especially the 17-year-olds, said, I said, who do you read? How do you get your information? Most of them were getting it from the web. And then my second question, of course, was, who do you believe? And usually the answer was, we don't really believe anyone because everybody lies. The West lies, the Estonian government lies, the Russians lie. And this one young person said, when I try to figure out what's happening in Ukraine, I call my grandmother who lives in Ukraine. I'm serious, you know, so this is one of the problems. There is a great lack of belief in the media, and also because people are so inundated with information, they throw up their hands and say, I can't handle it, it's too much, I'm tuning out. And that is very useful to Russian propaganda, because the citizens who are disenfranchised or encouraged just to kind of tune out, that works in their favor as well.
Alex?
We can spend an entire day talking about the woes of U.S. policy for promoting independent media and the pressures facing the U.S. budgets. But clearly it's associated with a shrinkage of the budgets that typically fund good governance, democracy promotion, including media. So this has been a downward trend for a number of years. And it's a worrisome trend. And it actually sort of points to the fact that we can't just look at short-term security risks and fund their solutions. It's time that we actually take a look at these long-term issues, including media and critical information flows, and you can't really exit the playing field when it comes to these issues. You have to stay engaged, and you have to remain there as a player. There is some interesting legislation right now on the Hill, actually, and I think it's a good step in the right direction. It's by Senator Rob Portman of Ohio and Senator Chris Murphy. They have proposed, actually, establishment of a whole-of-government approach associated with the center and some funding that should promote independent media, should focus on investigative journalists and efforts to counter propaganda and disinformation. So it's a good step in the right direction. There isn't a lot of funding associated with it, but if it happens, it's going to be something positive. And maybe one step that starts changing the tide of this absence of funding and attention.
Actually, we are out of time. I'm so sorry. Maybe final remarks of our participant, Jake.
Maybe, I mean, I just wanted to add one more thing about citizen engagement, that I think when we talk about online media, there is also this trend, especially among young people in the region, that not just that they are disengaged because there is just so much information, but that they are disengaged because they think that the truth will just emanate from the internet. And so they don't really have an understanding that they will also have to have a stake in it, because those owners, although the barriers for entering the market are surely lower, but those owners will have to take political risks. And if they want to do investigative pieces, they need money and they need citizen engagement.
Thank you. Alex, Jill, do you want to say something? Okay, so
Have fun, Alex?
No, thank you for your attention and the great questions.
you.
This is an important discussion to all of us, clearly, so thank you for being part of this.
yeah, thank you very much. We have a break now.